Hello everybody, this is Jacob from Junior Pastor Journeys, and today's video I will be doing another sermon message video that I've been working on for a little while. Let's just get straight into it. So the title of this message is called the Trauma of Holiness. Um, I would like to thank R.C. Sproul and his book The Holiness of God as the biggest inspiration for this message, especially the fourth chapter of the book that has the same title, The Trauma of Holiness. It was probably one of the best chapters I've ever read, honestly, in my entire life. I think it was very eye-opening, and this is why I'm doing this video now, to kind of share it with you guys. Before we get started, I want to read two definitions that I think really give a great start to this message. First is going to be from the 1642 Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 2, section 2, where it says, God hath all life, glory, goodness, blessedness in and of himself, and he is alone in unto himself all sufficient, not standing in need of any creatures which he hath made, not deriving any glory from them, but only manifesting his own glory. In, by, unto, and upon them he is the alone foundation of all being, of whom, through whom, and to whom are all things, and hath most sovereign dominion over them, to do by them, for them, or upon them whatsoever himself pleaseth. In his sight all things are open and manifest. His knowledge is infinite, infallible, and independent upon the creature, so as nothing is to him contingent or uncertain. He is most holy in all his counsels and all his works, and in all his commands. To him is due from angels and men and every other creature whatsoever worship, service, or obedience he is pleased to require of them. Second definition is going to be paragraph 213 of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. I think this is a really great, this has always been my favorite definition of mine when it comes to God. It states, we understand the divine name in this sense. God is the fullness of being and of every perfection, without origin and without end. All creatures receive all that they are and have from him. But he alone is his very being, and he himself is being. He himself is everything that he is. Before we move on, I just want to tell you guys that kind of getting over a bit of a cold right now. So that's why my voice feels a lot deeper. And if I just start coughing randomly, I'm not able to edit it out. That's why. If there's a lot of cuts, that's probably why. So let's get started. So when you hear the word trauma, right, and the title of this message is Trauma of Holiness, what is your typical reaction to it? Trauma typically has a negative connotation. For example, physical trauma, such as a car crash, or psychological trauma, such as a life-altering experience. But I'll be using trauma in a different light. I'll be defining it differently. Trauma, in this situation, I'll be using to describe the impact or magnitude of the trauma. That's the thing that I'll be focusing on. Trauma as an overwhelming experience of encountering something awe-inspiring and overwhelming. And you'll see how this unfolds. So let me get into the two, one of the stories that we'll be getting into. This message will have two stories, two very famous miracle stories of Jesus. One is the calming of the storm in Mark 4, and Simon Peter and Andrew's first encounter with Jesus in Luke chapter 5. So let me read Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to 41 for you guys. I'll put it on the screen now. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, let us go across to the other side. And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, Who is then this, that even the winds and the seas obey him? So you guys might hear, but I'm kind of at church right now. They're doing worship practice. I'll try to edit that part out. We'll see how my editing skills work out, though. So this is a very familiar story for a lot of you guys who've grown up in the church. You've probably heard the story many times. Children's ministry, preschool, Sunday school, vacation Bible school. And you essentially know the basic story. Jesus and his disciples are on a boat. A great windstorm comes in, The disciples wake up in a grave fear. They doubt Jesus and wonder why he isn't fearful. Jesus rebukes the storm and calls for stillness. The winds listen to him, and Jesus corrects and rebukes the disciples, and they make it out safely. And this story is very overlooked at times. I think the life of Jesus in general is just a blaze of miracles. From healing the sick to casting out demons, Jesus is just pumping out miracles left and right. And it's easy to lump this story with all his other miracle stories. And I feel like, especially in the Western American church, we've become really desensitized to these miracle stories. But I actually think there's a lot more to these stories than what the surface level Sunday school has to offer. And I'll be going into that for this video. So, what is a typical lesson that we get out of this story? I think one very common one that you guys could probably relate to is this: the events of our lives are like the storm, and if we trust in Jesus and have faith, the storm will pass and we will have peace. Another one is that if we just have to have faith in Jesus and he'll control the forces of nature. These points are very true. I don't doubt that at all. But something else caught my eye when I was reading the story. Something that is typically left out that goes unnoticed. Did you catch it? Let's go back to Mark chapter 4, verses 40 to 41. I'll read it again. I'll put it on the screen. It says, he said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And they were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him." Isn't this quite strange? You would think the disciples would be at peace or rejoicing. You'd expect their fear to vanish instantly once the danger had passed and the seas had calmed. Jesus had just saved them from this life-threatening situation. Most people would be admonishing Jesus and with praise and honor for saving their lives. Instead, Scripture describes the disciples as being even more afraid after the storm than before it. Their fear had actually increased rather than decreasing. Every time I've heard this story, this part is always left out or overlooked. We typically focus on the main event, but not the aftermath. Again, the question is, why were the disciples more afraid, more terrified after the storm than before it? Quite simply, they had encountered something that they had never encountered in their entire lives. They encountered something that shocked them to the very core. They encountered something that they could not explain. They experienced an event that could not be fathomed. They had met something more frightening than they ever had met in nature. In essence, they had encountered and were in the presence of holiness. And this leads me to my first point. Holiness is separate from everything we know. Let's go back to the disciples' original comment. They say, "Who is this?" Right? The King James Version, I think, states it a bit better. "What manner of man is this?" The words that the disciples said after the storm are very revealing. The disciples here were trying to find a category in which to place Jesus in. We typically put people into categories so that we know how to deal with them when we first meet them, right? If we know that someone's hostile, we're going to treat them very differently than if they are friendly. If we know someone is an intellectual, we're going to talk and treat them differently than if they are more of a social person. At the end of the day, we deal with people differently, and we ascribe categories based on what we think they are. Here's the thing about this situation, though. The disciples weren't even able to place Jesus in a category. Jesus was in a category of his own. Whenever we encounter someone new, we typically give them a general category, right? For example, if you meet somebody new, you could give a category of this person is smart, this person's funny, this person's nice, this person's annoying, they're pretty. And this was the same for the disciples. They had met all kinds of people. They had met tall men, they had met short men, they had met fat men, skinny men, smart men, stupid men, Greeks, Romans, Syrians, Egyptians, Samaritans, and fellow Jews. But there's one type of man that they've never encountered before. They had never encountered a holy man. Jesus was different from all the rest. He possessed an awesome otherness. He was the supreme mysterious stranger. He made people uncomfortable. But you might say, isn't being holy in and of itself a category? This is somewhat true, but it does need some explanation. What pops up when we hear the word holy? For many people, immediately the word pure or purity comes to mind. And this is true. Purity is definitely an aspect of holiness, but it isn't the main definition. The true definition of holiness, the primary definition, is separate, or separation. It comes from the ancient words, which mean to cut or to separate. More specifically, it means a cut above something. When we find something that is outstanding from the rest, we tend to separate it from the pile. If we find a piece of gold in a pile of gravel, we separate it from the rest. Many things are holy in the Bible. The Bible describes many things as being holy. Here are some examples: holy people, holy ground, holy Sabbath, holy bread, holy place. There's one thing that these all have in common. These things are holy, not in it of themselves, because God was the one who made them holy. God separated these items, and that's what makes them holy. Let's go back to the original question. Isn't being holy a category in and of itself? But here's the thing. All holiness describes is how something is set apart from the rest. All holiness does is show how God is entirely foreign from everything else we know. Because God is holy, God is entirely foreign. So in reality, holiness isn't a category, but as it only describes how something is set apart from everything we know. If I think an analogy that will help with this is the color analogy that I'm about to present now. We all know the colors: red, white, blue, purple, green, all that sort of things. We see these colors in our everyday lives. For example, you could describe a red car, a green traffic light, a yellow building, right? Now imagine humanity came to the knowledge of a color that no one was able to see or comprehend. Like, we just found it out some way, right? All we could do with this color is describe that color as being entirely different from every other color that we know. Because we don't know the actual color, we actually don't know the actual color. All we can do is describe it um, as in relation to everything else, right? And the same thing is true for holiness. We can only describe holiness as being separate from everything else that we know of. Just like the disciples in the storm, Simon Peter also had a traumatic encounter with Jesus. Jesus' holiness in Luke's account. Let's take a look at that. I'll be reading from Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. On one occasion, while the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he was standing in the lake of Gennesaret, and he saw two boats by the lake. But the fishermen had gone out of them and were washing all their nets. Getting into one of the boats, which was Simon's, he asked him to put out a little from the land, and he sat down and taught the people from the boat. And when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep and let down your net for a catch." And Simon answered, "Master, we've toiled all night and took nothing, but at your word I will let down your nets." And when they had done this, they enclosed a large number of fish, and their nets were breaking. They signaled to their partners in the other boat to come to help them. And they came and filled both of the boats so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, and he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of the fish that they had taken. And so were also James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching men." And when they had brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him. Again, many of us grew up with the story. You know the basic storyline. Jesus is preaching the word of God to people. He gets into Simon and Andrew's boat. He asks Simon to throw his net to catch more fish. Simon is skeptical but agrees. The net is filled with fish. Simon admits he's wrong, and Jesus says that he will catch men from now on. What's the typical lesson we got out of this story? Like in Mark's story, the story we just talked about, trust and have faith in Jesus, and he will do great miracles. Or another one is just don't doubt Jesus' ability to do anything, especially miracles. Again, these lessons are all true, but that's not what I'll be focusing on. Before the miracle, we were told that Simon had been fishing all night. He was not able to even catch a single fish. Simon was an experienced fisherman. This was his life. This was his vocation. He knew those waters well. He knew that a slow night like that meant no fish would come. So you can imagine the sarcasm in Simon's voice when he states, "Master, we've worked all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets." Simon wasn't expecting anything to happen. He was ready to just prove Jesus right and see him as just another wacky teacher. Instead, Simon Peter's entire life was changed before his eyes. So we all know what happens next. The net is thrown, a great multitude of fish pile up in the net. Simon's fishing partners rush to contain this, but not Simon. You'd expect his reaction to be of rejoice and to be helping his partners. Think about it. They had essentially just scored what could potentially be an entire year's worth of wages. They were set financially for at least the next couple of years. Instead, Simon had an unexpected reaction. Simon Peter fell down in front of Christ and exclaimed, "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." Why did Simon give this response? Based on what I've said so far, you could probably guess. Simon had entered into the presence of holiness. And this moves on to my third point. Holiness shows us who we truly are. First, holiness reveals our sinfulness. When Simon realized that he was in the presence of holiness, he was desperately uncomfortable. Instead of saying, "Lord, I adore you," he says, "Lord, I am sinful. Please go away." Sinful people tend to be uncomfortable in the presence of holiness. This is true even in my own life. Whenever I meet new people, whenever I tell them I'm a Christian, or specifically that I'm becoming a pastor, people change the way they interact with me. People suddenly become cautious of their words and avoid anything socially taboo. Whenever people cuss or say anything offensive, they immediately rush to apologize. People suddenly become hyper aware of their words, thoughts, and actions. People tend to stray away from specific topics because they believe that it's going to offend me or make me uncomfortable. I've even had people who intentionally avoided me or directly cut me off. Many people perceive that they're in the presence of holiness, and because of that, they become uncomfortable. They see this presence as a threat to their freedom. The greater the holiness, the greater the hostility towards it. And I'm not saying that I'm holy, but rather that people only perceive me as holy. I'm actually far from it. But let's contrast this to Simon Peter's response. Simon Peter, he was uncomfortable, but instead of avoiding holiness, he told the holiness to go away from him. Simon Peter acknowledged that he didn't deserve to be in the presence of holiness. This was because he knew that this holiness shined a light on his sin, which he could not bear. When holiness shines its light on us, our characters are wholly unraveled. When Simon Peter first encountered Christ, he understood who God was. But at that exact same moment, Simon Peter really understood who Simon Peter was. For when we come into the presence of God, we truly understand who we are. Holiness reveals our creatureliness. When we encounter God, we become hyper aware of ourselves as creatures. For when we meet the absolute, we understand how not absolute we are. When we meet the infinite, we understand how finite we are. When we meet the eternal, we understand how temporal we are. When we meet righteousness itself, we understand how sinful we are. When we meet the all-knowing, we understand how small and insignificant our knowledge is. This was Simon Peter's encounter with holiness. So I hope this video today has helped you. I hope it's changed the way that you've seen these common miracle stories, or changed your perspective on God's holiness. Maybe it's awakened you to God's foreignness, a separation, and why Simon Peter and the disciples were in such awe of this God. But from some of you guys, maybe this video didn't change or hit you. I was contemplating this after I first presented this message. When I read the book, I felt like my entire perspective had changed, and yet it seemed like it didn't faze other people. Why was this the case? This was when I realized something. I was scrolling on YouTube and I saw this video of this very beautiful Eastern Orthodox church in Serbia. This church was filled with icons, relics, and religious art, right? And the church was filled with gold everywhere. The dome at the center of the church was elevated at the highest, and sat at top was Jesus and the saints. I think the main goal a lot for like Eastern Orthodox, classical Protestants, and Catholics, they convey heaven in their churches, right? The highness is supposed to show the great heavens that are ahead of us. And I remember feeling a sense of transcendence, a sense of holiness when I watched this video. This is when I realized something. Just as holiness cannot be confined to human categories. It is not. It's not just as holiness cannot be confined to human categories. It is not experienced in just one way. God's holiness is shown and expressed in different ways. This isn't to diminish God's holiness in any way. Instead, I'm saying that we perceive holiness through the lenses of our experience. What do I mean by this? For some people, God's holiness is perceived through beautiful displays of theology, like in the book, The Holiness of God. For others, it's experiencing the beauty of the church, the architecture, the art, the liturgy, right? That mimics the heavens. For some people, maybe it's being out in creation, being out in nature, experiencing God's holiness through that. Pondering the complexity of even a single leaf, right? Being in awe of God's creation. Or maybe you encounter God's holiness in the context of a church community, seeing the saints, all the believers convening together, singing songs with one another. Maybe that conveys to you God's holiness. And so my question to you guys is, how will you encounter God's holiness in this day? But I think in this age, it can be pretty tough to encounter God's holiness sometimes because there's so many barriers in experiencing God's holiness. In today's age, we are surrounded by distractions, entertainment, so that keeps us content with the superficial, and social media that overwhelms us with information, shrinking our world and numbing our souls. We've allowed entertainment and social media and the constant stream of distractions to dull our senses. In a world where we settle for quick fixes and momentary pleasures, the profound, awe-inspiring presence of God often goes unnoticed. This tweet from Dr. Gavin Ortlund of Truth United has always captivated me. I remember when I first saw this tweet, I was just thinking like, wow, it makes so much sense. Yeah, he says here, the ancients stared at stars most nights. We stare at screens most nights. Stars make the world feel huge. They remind us that we are tiny. Screens often make the world feel small. They make us feel connected to everything. I wonder how this contributes to our anxiety. Here's the main point. Here's the main point that I'm trying to make. Essentially, is that we've settled for less when there's so much more out there. And for those of you who want to encounter God or to experience His holiness, because of what I've just said, it's partially not your fault. We've become so content with what the world has provided for us. Our souls have become so normalized to this that the urgency to seek out God's holiness is crushed. I like what John Piper says in his sermon, How God Made Him Happy, How God Made Me Happy in Him, John Piper's Journey of Joy, when he says, it isn't that we're settling for too little, but rather we're not settling for what's more. Here's my invitation. God's holiness is somewhere out there. He's waiting for you to discover it. But to experience it, you need to make a choice. You need to put down the distractions and noise of the world to seek Him. For I believe that God's holiness is so captivating, so enthralling, and so magical that it has the power to occupy your heart for the rest of eternity in an overflowing encapsulation of joy that cannot be contained. For I truly believe that God's holiness is the deepest longings of the human heart. And this is why you should seek God's holiness. The joy found in God's holiness will fill your heart for all of eternity in a way nothing else in this world can. I think St. Augustine was right when he said this. If I were to ask you why you believe in Christ, why you have become Christian, every man will answer truly, for the sake of happiness. So thank you guys for tuning into this video. I hope this was an encouragement for you guys to seek the holiness of God, to understand how the disciples were hit with this trauma of holiness, how they had encountered this transcendence. To conclude, 3 points. First, God's holiness is nothing like we've ever encountered before. 2, God's holiness is separation. And third, God's holiness God's holiness shows who we truly are. So thank you guys again. Please like, subscribe, and share. And with that, I'll see you guys next time. Please remember to always rejoice.